Welcome to Roundtable Talk, a podcast about longevity, senior services marketing, and the quality of life as one ages. Roundtable Talk is brought to you by Pavone Group and Varsity, a senior services agency focused on helping clients win the mature market. If you like the fresh perspectives we deliver in each episode, please give Roundtable Talk a 5-star review on the podcast service of your choice.
Thank you for joining us for this latest episode of Roundtable Talk. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Sara Zeff Geber to our episode. I've known Dr. Geber for some time now, and she's just has an amazing insights to share. And we'll put a link in, but here is the book that she has written, Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers. And she's been a contributor to Forbes.com. She was in a recent New York Times article, a featured, guest, if you will, there, discussing this topic. So we're thrilled to have you. Thank you, Dr. Geber. And I know you said I can call you Sara. So
yes,
thank you,
to
Sara.
be here.
Welcome. So you yourself are a solo ager, and in fact, you coined that term, solo ager. It's now being used by the entire industry to describe a large segment of the senior population. For those listening and watching, how do you define solo ager?
I define a solo ager as anyone who doesn't have children, married or single, and anyone who is aging alone who is not supported by family at some level nearby. So there's lots of categories of solo agers these days. When I first coined the phrase, I intended it to mean just people who didn't have children. Because when you look around you at what's going on in our society, it's the adult children that are taking care of the older adults in our country. So with the shift in demographics and the kind of what I call the family diaspora, people moving all over the place, solo aging has become more and more common. And solo living it's become more and more common. But now as the boomers age, we're really seeing a big issue with who is going to support those people that don't have the adult children or other family around to support them.
Interesting. So let's go back to the early days of your work in researching this population. What inspired you to devote your career to understanding solo agers?
Well, considering I am one, and I am one by virtue of the fact that I don't have children. I am married. My husband and I don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know which one of us is going to go first. And that's just the reality of our lives and of other people's lives who are child-free. So it started being a consideration for me about, 13 years ago. And then I got kind of fascinated by the phenomenon, and I did some research on how prevalent it is and found that I certainly wasn't alone, and then it was a growing theme in society.
Interesting. So in your book, Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers, you emphasize the importance of planning while in good physical and mental health. What are the most important steps that solo agers should take when they start planning for their own retirement?
Well, I think it doesn't vary too much from anyone who wants to kind of make sure that they are as healthy as possible throughout the rest of their life. The earlier you start planning financially, the earlier you start planning physically. In other words, staying in good shape, being really cognizant of what you eat, what you put in your body. And these are things that tend to pay dividends in the long run if we pay attention to them. So starting early with all aspects of growing older and all aspects of being potentially alone as we get older is an important thing. And I think the most important factor there is building a community. The more we can begin to build community as we go through middle age and into our later life, it will pay so many dividends later in life. So those are the most critical areas.
That's a great point. I mean, the first point you made, certainly there are lessons in there for anybody who's aging, which is anybody. But the whole notion of building community, I think, given where we are today as a society with technology, it's so easy to isolate ourselves, and it's so
Mhm.
easy to fall into the trap of not having that sense of community or that true community around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, not necessarily related to this topic, but what do you look forward to as you continue to age?
Well, I I certainly want to continue to live in the community that I have grown to love, um, but not forever. I've visited enough continuing care retirement communities, life plan communities, and all levels of senior living that I'm quite certain that my future, hopefully my husband's and my future, but certainly mine, will be in a life plan community. I live in kind of the outskirts of the San Francisco Bay Area, and there are many, many, many life plan communities in the Bay Area. And I've probably visited them all um, in my presentations or my consulting work or something. So that's been an advantageous for me personally because I've gotten to check them all out. I've kind of narrowed down the field and we'll choose one and make that our final home.
Well, I look forward to hearing which one you choose. I'm not going to ask you to name names, but if you could define what you think is the ideal lifeline community for you as a solo ager, how would you describe it?
This and I will be happy to do that. And as I do that, I think that I'm really describing the ideal community for most solo agers and maybe most people in general. But what I look for now is how involved are the residents in the governance of the community, the activities that take them outside the community. Are they engaged with a nearby college or university? Are they engaged with maybe a daycare center, somewhere where they can have some intergenerational contacts? Maybe they have contacts with one of the food banks, and people can go out into the community and cook and serve food. I think that is so important. It may not have been as important to our parents' generation, but it's pretty important for boomers, I've found. Now, there's also a faction of boomers that want the experience of what's the Jimmy Buffett community called?
Oh, yeah, Margaritaville or
Margaritaville. That's their image of later life. But I find more and more that that's not what most people envision for themselves in a forever context. They want to have a community where they have reason to get up in the morning, where they have a sense of meaning and purpose as long as they possibly can. So that's what I'm looking for. There's one interesting community in the Bay Area. It's certainly not in the best area of the Bay Area. It's not the fanciest community. But whenever I go there, and I've been speaking there about once a year to their prospects and whatnot, but I am always so impressed with how engaged their residents are. I remember the first time I was there, I was invited to stay for dinner, and I accepted. And so I was sitting and chatting after my presentation with the marketing director, and I said, before we go to dinner, I'm just wondering where can I get a glass of wine to have with dinner or sip on beforehand? And he said, "Oh, let me check if the residents run the bar. Let me check and see what we have to do here." And I thought that was so healthy. Just the fact that he had to go to the residents to find out what was happening, when the bar was going to open, um, how I would pay for my drink or whether it would be complimentary. I just thought that was amazing. So I like to recount that story because if that in that particular community, the residents run a lot. So
that's great. That's great. So they have a true sense of community, but certainly accountability and play a large role in it.
yeah,
Just like I think we all want that sense of control in our lives, right?
absolutely, absolutely.
Interesting. So, getting back to solo aging, without family support, how can solo agers build networks for the emotional, the physical, financial support, all of those kinds of things? And where does that support come from for this group that you've focused your professional experience on?
That's the challenge for most solo agers, and I my life, my work is kind of um, it's in two veins. One, I work with solo agers. I hold workshops for solo agers. I speak to solo agers and in senior centers and all over the place. And then I also work with senior living communities as a consultant and as a speaker. So when I am with the solo agers, I'm encourage them always to begin to build community early, begin to take a look at their finances early. And I'm a big fan of enlisting the help of a financial advisor. I think managing our finances is, for most people, not their forte, and we can't ignore it. Most of us should be still building our finances. So, getting professional help with that, getting professional legal help in developing a advanced directive for healthcare and a power of attorney, all of those things. The earlier you can do them, the better off you'll be. You certainly need to revisit them many times. I try and revisit mine at least every 7 years because things change. The environment around me changes. The people in my life shift around sometimes. Some of them leave, um, and so it takes some vigilance. It also takes some fortitude to really get going on that. I've seen the resistance to doing that in solo agers that come up so often, because the challenging thing for solo agers is to choose proxies. When you sit down with an estate attorney, and he or she gives you the form to fill out so that they can prepare an estate plan for you, there is that question, that who is going to speak for you when and if you cannot speak for yourself. And a lot of solo agers have nobody to put down, and because they haven't cultivated anyone. And you can cultivate people that you can remain close to and you can include in your community from an early age, certainly from middle age. There are many solo agers who have no family to count on in that regard, but they may know younger people that they can ask to be that proxy for them.
I did
Some
think that was
people will.
interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying some people will say, no, I'm uncomfortable with that. I think my experience has been that most people they're I don't want to use the word flattered, but they're moved to be asked to do that, and that could be a good source. Nieces and nephews are a good source of people to be your proxies, but that's a challenge. That's the big challenge for solo agers, because they need to cultivate those relationships.
I did think it was interesting in your book how you share stories and a lot of anecdotes. And I don't know if how many of the names you changed. I realize it's only first names, but how, you tell a story about a couple who moved into a neighborhood, established a relationship with a younger, neighbors, and how they really, created that connection as a way to provide them with not only, long-term friends from that point forward, but also people who they could lean on for these kinds of resources.
Yeah, Fred and Hildy, the older neighbors of my friends Andrea and Peter. Those are
Okay.
actually the only names in the book that I did not change,
Okay.
because I got permission from my friend Andrea to talk about them. And Fred and Hildy have now passed on, but Fred and Hildy were classic solo agers, and they were in their 80s, and they really had no one. They had no kids, and they befriended their neighbors. Unfortunately, their neighbors were good, solid, caring, honest people. Um, And so they
that's
ended up
critical, obviously.
being their guardians later in life. But the scary part of that story is that Fred and Hildy got into their 80s without knowing what they were going to do. And it just so happened that Andrea and Peter kind of came along and moved into the house 3 doors down. So that's why I
Sure.
caution people not to leave things to chance like that, because they may not have a couple 3 doors down that would be the honest proxies that Andrea and Peter became.
That's great. So, what are some of the key elements of retirement planning that solo agers often overlook? I mean, you've kind of alluded to some, but what are some of those primary points?
Well, I'm always going to come down on community being the most important. But certainly financial and legal are important too. When I do my workshops for solo agers, we spend a lot of time talking about the financial and the legal. I always have a guest expert come in to talk about the finances, to talk about the legal. I bring in a senior care advisor to talk about what caregiving looks like, because a lot of people don't know. And so it gives them an opportunity to kind of slowly build up an understanding of what they're going to need and to start to put those resources in place.
That's great. Well, obviously you're spending your career, thinking about this subject. What's been one of the most challenging aspects preparing for your own solo aging journey?
Well, I've had to do the same things because I'm quite aware that I need to walk my talk. So I have spent a lot of time making sure that my husband and I keep up with our estate plan and our financial advisor. We're fortunate that we've had good careers all of our life. This is totally a second career for me. I used to be a management consultant up to about 15 years ago. Um, so we have had to keep up with that. And I think also making sure that I'm still watching to see where our next community might be, which life plan community would be right for us. But also being I try to be of help and a kind of a model for the people around me who, whether they're solo agers or not, and encourage them to do the planning that I think is so critical. I have one set of neighbors that we've become very friendly with, and they're not classic solo agers. They have one son that they're very close to emotionally, but not physically. He married a Danish woman, so they're raising their kids in Copenhagen. Well, that's a long way from the San Francisco Bay Area.
Indeed.
So, I kind of nudge them a little bit toward thinking about the future, because he's not in a position to rush in a crisis, but somebody nearby needs to be. So
That's a great point. And I'm sure your role as a management consultant really has laid a strong foundation in your experience to be able to, support and help individuals and organizations.
It has. I have a strong communication training and background, so that helps. Yeah.
Well, that's great. So, while there are challenges, what have been some of the unexpected joys or positive aspects of solo aging that you've personally discovered along the way?
Oh, Derek sent me his list of questions before we got going on this, and I just loved that question, because I have met some of the most wonderful people in the senior living industry and in the world of aging and retirement. I did some retirement coaching before I kind of discovered solo aging and specialized in that. And I met people that were in the business of developing retirement coaching practices, and I learned a lot from them. And then when I got really interested in the whole solo aging and how the senior living industry fits so strongly and necessarily into that, then I started getting to know people in that industry, and it has been a delight. Um, the people that I knew and the clients I had in management consulting did not have the heart that the people I meet in the senior living industry do, and in the aging community. It's just a whole different ball game. And honestly, I wish I had found this as the avenue for my career when I was in my 20s or 30s, but here I am now, and really enjoying the people that I've met.
Well, that's great. What a great second chapter, I guess,
Yeah.
in your life. So, what role does technology play in helping solo agers, maintain their independence, build, supportive communities, et cetera?
Well, it certainly helps solo agers who have far-flung families to stay in touch with one another. Most of my friends who have grown kids who live in other states or other countries have weekly online Zoom meetings or FaceTime, and so that just simply wouldn't exist, or didn't exist 20 years ago. And now it's at least a way to keep in touch. Um, and it so exceeds the ability to really maintain a connection. It's so much better than just a voice. So in a sense, people have an opportunity to see their parents who are aging, to see their kids who are maybe struggling with any number of things. It certainly doesn't. It doesn't make up for that face-to-face, touchable contact. And I will. I have gotten into some arguments with people who say, "Oh, you don't really need to be there as long as we had Zoom." And I said, "No, I actually try to avoid as many Zoom contacts as possible. I've been asked to do some work with uh, some senior centers and some villages um, uh, through Zoom, and I've said nope. Not going to do it. I'm happy to do it in person, but I'm just not going to do it via Zoom. Not when you're all together there in one geographic location."
I think that's great. And while you're talking about communities, senior living communities, life plan communities, you speak at a lot of these organizations, but you also advocate for them over aging in place or staying at home. What makes them a better option in your mind?
It's right there in the name, community. I think I just don't think people understand what aging in place is really going to look like. They think they're still going to be able to hop into their car and go meet their friends for lunch and order, whatever they need and go out and do things. But the reality of that is not what they think it's going to be. And for most people, aging in place ultimately becomes a pretty isolating experience.
Hmm.
So I know that there are millions of people out there that are still going to do it. And it's pretty viable if you have adult children that live nearby and that can make sure that you have groceries and medications and that you're taking them regularly and that you're doing, I don't know, everything from the physical therapy that your orthopedist recommended to eating the right foods, all of those things. There's somebody, for people who have adult children, that are with them, that are there, that are paying attention. It's a pretty different experience than for a solo ager who's alone in their own home. Even a couple who is alone in their own home that doesn't have people looking in on them. It can be a challenging situation. Everybody wants to die having spent a great day on the golf course and a wonderful meal, and then they just die in their sleep. And unfortunately, we'd all like to go that way, but unfortunately, that's not the reality for most people. So,
Yeah, it generally doesn't work that way, does it? But that's a great point. But what can communities do to better serve this demographic? What do they need to put in place, programming or otherwise?
well, senior living communities are pretty well invested in that game anyway. There have always been plenty of widows and widowers that are residents in senior living communities. In many senior living communities, the single people, the unattached people, outnumber the couples. It depends which the balance that any particular community has, but the difference for solo agers is that there's nobody coming to take them out for Thanksgiving. There's nobody coming to celebrate birthdays with them. So, in a very real sense, senior living communities are going to need to step up the game of actually replacing the family that that solo agers don't have, and that can take a lot of different forms. So it's a different topic than the whole issue of making sure that people have meaning and purpose and something to do in their lives, but there are a lot of things that adult children do for their aging parents. It's not planned in advance. Most people have this experience it unfolds day by day. And they're there when the people who manage the care at the senior living community or manage the day-to-day life of the people in the community, of the residents, when they have a question about, I don't know if this person has a history of, I don't know what it might be, a history of sleepwalking, or does this person have a history of not being able to manage their finances, or there's nobody to call for a solo ager. So a lot of that knowledge has to be developed early on by the community. And many communities, I think, are going to have to keep a pretty good Rolodex, to use an old term, but a resource database of people that might come in and take fiduciary responsibility for an older adult who has no living children. In California, we have a wonderful thing called a licensed professional fiduciary, and that is what they do. They are, in a sense, they take the place of the adult children that they don't have. I have talked to several fiduciaries. I know that I will engage a professional fiduciary to be that person who will come in and speak for me if I cannot. I also have a cousin and a niece that will play a role there, but I want someone local. I want someone that really knows the resources in my area to be the kind of on the front line, communicating with my far-flung family, whoever is left. But that person needs to speak for me and to be the resource for the senior living community. And I think it may get to a point where a resident is going to be, in a sense, required to have someone that will to back them up. And I think a senior living community that is doing a good job in sourcing people can have a kind of a vetted list of individuals that can do that. Much the same as when someone gets seriously interested, then I know that most senior living communities have move specialists, senior move specialists. In the same way, they need to have some people, maybe in other states, they might be professional licensed guardians who are that backup person. So anyway,
No, that's a really interesting
about that.
No, that's a really interesting thought, that for communities or organizations, when somebody moves in relatively young, relatively vibrant, in theory at least, they're going to be there the rest of their lives, and there does need to be that provision. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, there's no easy answers to that, but we're going to have to figure it out.
Yep. Now, you'd mentioned in a recent conversation that communities, when they're talking to solo agers, shouldn't focus solely on amenities. You've mentioned that you look for communities where people are involved in meaningful activities, community services, that sort of thing. You talked a little bit about it earlier on in the conversation, but anything you want to add to that, or other things that you look for personally?
Well, again, to me, it's all about engagement. How engaged are the residents in outside activities? And it could be sports, it could be games, but in many cases, it needs to be something more gratifying than that, more meaningful, which might probably mean going out into the community and working with people who are younger, uh, or people who are disadvantaged in some way.
That's great. Interesting. Now, what role does gender play? Have you observed any differences between male and female solo agers in terms of their planning, social support systems, things that they need or are seeking?
Well, the differences that we all experience every day manifest themselves in solo agers too. Men are less inclined to plan. They're less inclined to be engaged socially. Women do a better job of building community, and women still live longer. So there are more women solo agers out there than there are men, but there are plenty of men, and men do need to plan as well. Men often are I want to say do a better job with their finances, but really still men have made more money in their lives. So their finances tend to be in better shape than women's, simply by virtue of the fact that they've just been able to make more in their lifetime. So yeah, I think I definitely admire men who acknowledge that this is going to be, they're getting older and this is where they're going to live is going to be important. Um, so, those are the differences that I see.
Sure. Well, that is interesting. I've led a number of group discussions in communities, and many times I'll be speaking with women whose they and their husband made the decision of where they wanted to live their lives, and the husband really did it to make sure that the wife was set up because they figured they would pass
Yeah,
first, and in fact they did. And
usually
the
do.
wife is, obviously eternally grateful for having that foresight, that kind of selfless notion, because in many cases, maybe the husband didn't want to make that move.
Yeah.
But so I'm curious, what policy changes would you like to see to better support this population of solo agers?
Well, I think people who have money are in much better shape, obviously, to be able to make choices for themselves, hopefully make good choices. It's the lower end of the population and the forgotten middle that worries me. I am seeing progress slow. I'm seeing progress made in the senior living industry toward making some accommodation for the for middle class people, because senior living has always been pretty out of reach for most people. But if we can find a way to make senior living accessible to people that have made a modest income all of their lives, my the greatest there's a great example for that in Boston. It's the Two Life community. And they have done an excellent job, and it's a great model of building a facility that is designed for middle class Americans, for older middle class Americans. And, it simply involves more participation in the running of the community from the residents. And that makes sense anyway from some of the other things I said earlier. They're having great success. Their community is full, and I try and stay in touch with them just for the fact that they're such a great model. And then, of course, at the lower end, I'm a big fan of the PACE program. For If anybody doesn't know what PACE is, it's the Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. That's what the acronym is. And expanding that program will be very important.
Absolutely. And I know, just from looking at the industry, you're absolutely right. the higher end, socioeconomically, there are lots of options, and the lower end, there are lots of options with affordable housing, even though there's not enough to fulfill the demand, but there certainly
Yeah.
are options out there. But that middle is really, I think that's the
Yeah.
next issue to crack.
Yeah. Those are the people that think they're just going to age in place. And
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. So you've been studying this group of folks for more than a decade. How has the senior living field come? How far has it come in that time, understanding this population and serving their needs, and what work remains?
I think they're actually doing a really good job. I find tremendous interest when I go out into the senior living world and talk about solo aging. Tremendous interest, very little pushback. And I don't know if I've ever seen anyone actually push back and say, you're full of baloney. This isn't happening. It's so obvious that it's happening. It just couldn't be more obvious. So figuring out the right solution for your community is going to be incumbent on you to do in the next few years, because we're going to we're going to have that avalanche. It's already starting, and being prepared for that in the ways that you and I have talked about, Derek, is going to be critical for all senior living communities.
Absolutely. So how do you see the landscape of solo aging evolving over the next decade, especially as the number of childless adults grows?
Well, that's growing. When I started looking at the numbers, the statistics, I discovered that, of course, the baby boomers had twice as many. Well, the rate of childlessness was double, let's say that. In all previous generations, it had been about 10%. With the boomers, it reached almost 20%. Gen X, on the other hand, that took a little bit of a dip. They had more kids. But they're still at about the 12, 13, 14% level. And it's that family diaspora that also enters into the picture. So I think that in the future generations are going to have more and more of the experience of this. Gosh, the generation that's in their 20s and 30s now, their rate of childlessness is huge.
Mm-hmm.
So they may change their minds. The boomers changed their minds, and a lot of people had kids in their 30s and into their 40s. But we'll see. But I think it's only going to grow.
Yep. Interesting. So one last question. What have you learned that you wish you could have told your younger self to help you prepare for your future? What do you wish you could go back and tell your younger self?
Oh, gosh. Let's see. What would that be? Probably probably to to discover the world of aging and retirement and the professionals in that world, that I could do the work I've done with my background in psychology and organizational behavior, that I could have done that in a different industry than the tech world. So.
That's great. Well, I don't know if you know Dr. Robin Stone, who is at Leading Age. She's been there for a number of years and has a storied career. She often refers to aging services as an accidental career, that people don't often start there, but they
Yep.
find it and love it once they get there. So it sounds like that's the case for you.
It's so true. That's certainly been the case for me. The people in this world are just, they have just been like a warm cocoon for me. So
I love that.
I'm a pretty happy camper with what I'm doing.
That's great. Well, Dr. Geber, I cannot thank you enough for being here today and sharing your wisdom, sharing your thoughts. Again, we'll put a link to it, but the book is Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers. And Dr. Geber's website is sarazeffgeber.com. That's Sarah without an H. Zeff, Zeff, and Geber, 1B.com. We'll put a link as well. But thank you, Dr. Geber. Really, really appreciate your time and insights that you shared with us today.
Thank you, Derek. This has been a pleasure.
That's great. And I'd also like to thank Dave Schaffner, our producer, and Matt Campbell, our engineer, for everything that they've done in putting this and every other episode together. But take care, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye.